The beach was never a place I visited often. Life had kept me too busy, caught between work and responsibilities, and I had almost forgotten what it felt like to just breathe beside the sea. That evening, when my friend suggested a sudden trip to the coast, I agreed without thinking too much. I didn't know it would become a turning point, not because of the ocean or the sand, but because of someone who had always been there in the background yet had never stood out until that night. Rayan was part of our group, familiar but never more than that. We had spoken in passing, exchanged polite words, but I had never looked at him twice. He blended into the crowd, not loud, not seeking attention, just quietly present. But on the beach that evening, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the fading sun touched the waves, maybe it was the salt in the air that made everything feel more alive, or maybe it was just the fact that for the first time I actually noticed him. The group was laughing, running along the shore, taking pictures and acting carefree, but I found myself holding back. I have always been the one who stands slightly apart, watching rather than joining. It wasn't sadness. It was just who I was. And it was in that moment of standing apart that I realized I wasn't alone. Rayan was there too, not pushing himself into the center, not demanding to be heard, simply walking nearby as though he understood. He didn't make a show of it, but when the breeze turned cold, he noticed me shiver. Without a word, he draped his jacket lightly over my shoulders. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was thoughtful, and for some reason it stayed with me. Later, when I lingered near the water while the others moved further away, I turned around and saw him waiting a few steps behind, hands in his pockets, not intruding but not letting me be alone either. He didn't speak, but his presence spoke enough. At the time, I brushed it off as simple kindness. After all, he could just be polite, just the kind of person who looks out for others. But on the ride home, I caught myself replaying those little moments, and I realized I was curious. Why had he done those things without needing acknowledgement? Why did it feel so different from the casual gestures people usually make? That night when I lay in bed, it wasn't the crashing waves or the laughter of my friends that I remembered most. It was the way he noticed things without me having to say them, the way he stayed close without making it uncomfortable. It made me wonder how many times I had overlooked him in the past, how many times he had been quietly there without me realizing it. For the first time, I felt a spark of something I hadn't expected. Not love, not yet, but awareness. It's strange how a simple evening can shift the way you see someone. I went to the beach thinking it was just another outing, a way to escape routine. But I returned with the beginning of a thought I couldn't ignore. The sand, the waves, the sunset. All of it faded compared to the memory of one person who, without saying much, had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. The night after the beach felt different, even though it began like any other group gathering. We had rented a small place near the coast to stay for the weekend, and everyone was still caught up in the carefree energy of the trip. Music played softly in the background, conversations overlapped, and laughter filled the room. Yet somehow, I found myself noticing only one person in the middle of it all. Rayan was sitting close by, not too far, not too near, just within reach. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, and though neither of us moved away, neither of us commented on it either. I don't know when the rest of the room started to fade, but eventually our conversation slipped into its own quiet space. We weren't talking about anything extraordinary. Childhood memories, dreams we carried, fears we rarely admitted out loud. His words carried an ease that made me lower the guard I usually kept up around people. He didn't try to impress me with polished stories. He simply shared pieces of himself, and in return I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't planned to. There was something grounding about the way he listened. Not just nodding along, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually hearing what I said. When I told him about moments I wished I could relive, he asked thoughtful questions that made me reflect deeper. When I admitted to doubts I rarely voiced, he didn't dismiss them but acknowledged them with quiet understanding. The longer we spoke, the more I realized how natural it felt, as if we had been having these conversations for years instead of hours. The room was still alive with chatter, but in our corner, it felt like a different world. At one point I became aware of how close we were sitting. It wasn't intentional, just something that happened as the night unfolded. Our shoulders leaned together, and in that pause between words, I heard myself whisper with a half-smile, "Do you realize how close you are right now?" I hadn't planned to say it. It slipped out before I could stop myself, part teasing, part nervous truth. The words hung in the air longer than I expected. For a moment I thought he might pull away, laugh, or change the subject. But he didn't. He looked at me calmly, a hint of warmth in his eyes, and instead of answering with distance, he answered with a story. He spoke about closeness, not in terms of space but in terms of understanding. He said that sometimes people could sit inches apart and feel like strangers, and sometimes they could be miles away and still feel connected. Then he added, almost softly, that what mattered most wasn't the distance between two people but whether they truly saw each other. His voice wasn't dramatic, yet every word struck deeper than I expected. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, replaying his words, realizing that this was no ordinary conversation. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't casual. It was something that touched a part of me I had kept hidden. When I finally looked at him, I saw that he wasn't trying to create a moment. He was simply being honest. That honesty made my heart beat faster than any grand gesture could have. From that point on, something shifted. The noise of the room returned, the laughter of friends carried on, but for me, the night had changed. It wasn't just about the beach trip anymore. It was about the closeness I had suddenly become aware of, not just in distance but in connection. His presence felt different, his words stayed longer, and for the first time, I wondered if I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't ignore. That night stayed with me long after everyone else had fallen asleep. I lay awake replaying his words, wondering why they carried such weight. I wasn't someone easily swept away. I had been careful with my heart, cautious not to mistake comfort for love. Yet, with Rayyan I felt something different. It wasn't just his nearness that unsettled me. It was the quiet way he seemed to recognize parts of me I rarely showed. I couldn't decide if that closeness was dangerous or exactly what I had been searching for without realizing it. In the days that followed, I found myself paying attention to the smallest things. The way his messages arrived at the exact moments I needed them most. The thoughtfulness in how he remembered tiny details from conversations everyone else would forget. The steadiness in his tone when he spoke about his life. Not boasting but sharing with a kind of sincerity that made me believe him. It wasn't that he was perfect. He had flaws, insecurities, and moments of self-doubt, but it was his willingness to admit them that drew me closer. I tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting connection born out of the trip, a passing closeness that would fade once life pulled us back into routine. But the truth was harder to deny. My mind drifted to him when I wasn't with him, and my heart reacted to the simplest gestures. A shared glance, a laugh that lingered, a silence that felt fuller than words. These were not things I could dismiss as coincidence. Yet, alongside the warmth grew hesitation. I had known disappointment before, had believed in connections that never lasted. The memory of those endings whispered warnings, urging me to hold back, to protect myself from another fall. I told myself to be careful, to slow down, but feelings don't always obey reason. What I felt around him was already spilling past the edges of caution. One evening, I found myself alone, thinking about the invisible line I had always drawn in relationships. I had promised myself I would never cross it unless I was certain, unless I believed it was real. That line was where friendship ended and something deeper began. And though I kept telling myself not to step over it, I couldn't ignore how close I had already come. His presence had blurred the boundaries I once thought were clear. The realization terrified me. Loving someone meant giving them the power to hurt you, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that again. But the thought of turning away from him, of pretending this closeness didn't matter, felt even more unbearable. It was as though life had handed me a choice, to retreat into safety or to risk something greater. I knew I couldn't answer that choice in one night, but my heart was already leaning toward the risk. Each moment with him was weaving itself into something larger, something I could no longer dismiss as temporary. His words about closeness echoed in my mind, not just as a passing thought but as a quiet truth I couldn't ignore. He was right. What mattered wasn't the distance between us, but the way we truly saw each other. And the more I allowed myself to see him, the more I realized how much he was seeing me too. That awareness grew heavier with every interaction. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. I was standing on the edge of a decision, and though fear still lingered, so did hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt that stepping forward might not be a fall but a beginning. The decision didn't come to me in a single burst of clarity, but in the slow unfolding of ordinary days. I began to notice how my life was changing in subtle ways because of him. My mornings felt lighter knowing that by evening there would be a message waiting for me. My worries, which I often carried in silence, no longer seemed so heavy when shared with him. Even when we disagreed, there was never the fear of being dismissed or misunderstood. It was as though he had quietly carved out a space in my world where I felt both seen and safe. One night after a long day we spoke again. His voice carried a calmness that settled me, yet there was something more in the pauses between his words. I could sense he was holding back, as though he was waiting for me to open a door I had kept firmly shut. That was when I remembered what he had said at the beach. That closeness wasn't about distance but about recognition. I realized then that I had been recognized long before I admitted it to myself. He had seen me clearly, and what unsettled me most was how deeply I wanted to be seen that way. I asked him quietly if he realized how close he was to me, not in physical distance but in the way he had managed to become a part of my thoughts, my choices, even my silences. For a moment he didn't reply, and the quiet stretched between us. Then, with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, he said that he had always known, but he was waiting for me to acknowledge it too. Those words sank into me like truth I had resisted but could no longer deny. It was not about sudden passion or dramatic gestures, but about the steady certainty that had built itself over time. And in that moment, I felt the line I had drawn for so long begin to fade. It wasn't that I crossed it recklessly, but that I realized it no longer served me. I had kept it as a form of protection, a barrier against disappointment. But what I shared with him wasn't fragile or fleeting, it was built on something stronger, something that had been growing quietly with every conversation, every glance, every moment of recognition. Once I allowed myself to step past that fear, everything felt clearer. We began to speak more openly, no longer circling around the feelings we both knew were there. He shared his worries about the future, his hopes, and how he had always believed that some connections were worth waiting for. I confessed my fears of being hurt, of misreading signals, of investing my heart where it might not be safe. He listened without judgment, reminding me that love was never without risk, but that some risks were worth taking when they came with honesty and care. The days that followed were filled with a quiet transformation. It wasn't about grand declarations but about the way our bond naturally deepened. He didn't have to prove himself with promises, and I didn't have to prove myself with defenses. We met each other exactly as we were, with our imperfections, our hesitations, and our courage. And strangely, it was those imperfections that made everything feel real. Looking back, I realize it was never about that one night at the beach, but about the journey that led to it and the choice that followed. That moment simply became the turning point where we both admitted what had been building all along. Love, I learned, is rarely about dramatic turning points or instant certainty. It grows quietly, waiting for the courage to be acknowledged. Even now, I carry that night with me, not because it was filled with fireworks, but because it was honest. It was the night I stopped resisting what my heart already knew. It was the night I chose to see him not just as someone from my past or someone who happened to be there, but as someone who mattered in my present and could matter in my future. I don't know where every path will lead, but I know this. When love feels this genuine, it changes you. It teaches you that closeness is not measured by how near someone stands to you, but by how deeply they reach into your life. And once you experience that kind of closeness, there is no turning back because you finally understand.